there's something about making something that other people don't understand that makes it even more interesting.
Michelle, welcome to Shape Your Pottery and share with me, what's a failure you have experienced that you believe many potters are heading for?
Well, Nick, a few years ago, I was super excited about creating templates and stencils on a silhouette cutter. And I've been admiring Renee Lepresti's work, and I learned that she had made her own stencils. And I wanted to get started with these new ideas that I had. So I had this upcoming trip with friends to the Pacific Northwest. And I had this idea that I was going to make them each a mug that would represent our experience that we were going to have. And so I designed this mug. I spent all this time putting it together with the Silhouette Design Studio and also with my own, using Procreate. And I was really excited about the way they looked. They looked so good when they were on Greenware. And then I got to the last and final stage, which was after the bisque and before the glaze. And I realized that I wasn't sure if I wanted to put clear glaze over it, and I hadn't tested the underglazes to see what they would look like with and without clear glaze over them. I went ahead and I went for it. I made 10 of these mugs. So I had spent a fair amount of time making these mugs and really babying them through the drying process because they were porcelain and had shaped a special handle and things like that. And I went ahead and glazed them all with this clear glaze over the top that totally felt like it was the right thing. It was like I was pretty secure in that decision. Well, I decided there would be one that didn't have clear glaze. That would just be like a tester to see what it would look like without the clear glaze. But I was pretty sure it was going to turn out fine. And of course, the day, where I'm going with this, the day that I open up the kiln, I look at the ones that have the clear glaze on them, and they're all muted and faded, and it looks totally meh. And the only one that ends up turning out is the one that was really my test piece, which did not have the clear glaze over the top. It was one of those things where I knew that I needed to test and really, in advance of doing a large project, make sure that I knew that I liked what the results would be. And I just pushed forward and just lost sight of that. So that was a pretty big failure, and I ended up giving all those mugs away to somebody else besides my friends, somebody else who I was like, okay, if you really want them, they're all yours. I don't love them, but you can have them. And the only one that I ended up giving away, which was actually the one that did not have the clear glaze on it. So
that is quite the story. Shaping Nation, if you have a big project, make sure to test things out beforehand so that you can give the customer or the people you're giving the pottery to the best piece possible. Tell me the story how you got started making pottery.
Well, I don't have a formal art education. I've always loved to create. It's a place where I live quite frequently because it gives me such a sense of joy. And whenever I make something, whether it's something really simple and basic or something more complicated, I just find this, almost meditative state with my work. It's just a really exciting thing for me. And I come from a family that is, there's a lot of creatives in my family. My parents are these fiercely independent entrepreneurs. They're super self-reliant. They're creative small business owners. So in the spirit of their generation, they never hire somebody that could do something for them if they can do it themselves. So I grew up watching my dad sew and make decorative woodwork for our house. And my mom still has this exquisite high-altitude garden where she goes out and finds forages, plants out in the woods and brings them back to her garden and grows those at 10,000 feet. So I have a sister who's a potter. I have another sister who's a maker. I have a cousin who's a painter. So I have all these people who don't have any kind of formal art degrees, but are doing all of this work that they just love to make. They're just really excited about making. And, I still remember when I first made my first piece of pottery, and my mom has saved this little ornament that I made. But honestly, it really started when I first met this potter named Peter Karner. And Peter was the boyfriend of my very best friend. And he lived out in this area called Cherry Creek. And he had a yurt and a wood fire kiln and had an amazing setup. And I just thought, this is incredible. And I started collecting pottery around that same time because his work was gorgeous. And then I also started to admire other people's work. And as time went on, I realized that, there were a lot of talented potters in this region. So I right after we had a house burned down and forest fire here in Durango. And so right after that, one of the very first things that I purchased was a wood fire series from a woman named Jennifer Neff. I also found some potters in this area like Lorna Meaden and Blair and Marty Meerfeld. And then I finally happened along Chaco Hashimoto's work, which is absolutely gorgeous. And it turned out that Chaco had a Onomi pottery studio here in Durango and offered classes in pottery. And I signed up for one of her classes, and that's pretty much where things got started. I took a class in a community studio. I wasn't a community pottery member yet because she had a wait list, and she also makes sure that people are ready to become members. And the way that she does that is by having them take several classes to make sure that they know like the foundation of pottery before they're set loose in her studio. So I took some classes with her. I discovered that it was incredibly hard for me, and I was not at all naturally talented at pottery. And she just made it look so easy and so, just like her fingers were just like dancing on the pottery wheel. And mine, on the other hand, I felt like I had 10 thumbs. It was just a really kind of awkward experience for me. But I just stuck with it. I thought about quitting the first day of class. I'm not going to lie. I was just like, whoa, I'm not one of those people who was like, I fell in love with, working on the wheel. It was more like I was just fighting it and fighting it. And I think that's part of what actually kept me interested was the challenge of it, because in some ways, that challenge can actually be inspiring to make you want to keep coming back to it and try it again and again. So, and that's exactly what I did. I just kept trying. And finally, after some time, lots of hours on the wheel, I started to get good at it and started to feel very enjoyable for me. But it wasn't until after a lot of practice that occurred. So yeah, that's how things got started for me with pottery.
Definitely agree with the challenge. Because when I first started pottery, it was like 4 of us that did it all at once. And I was the worst one, but I didn't like to lose. And that challenge kept me trying to get my work to get better.
I'm competitive in that way too, Nick. I can totally relate with that. It's like it does help me to have other people that are like pushing me a little bit. So
yep, definitely agree. So tell me about your time studying at the Onomi Pottery Studio.
Yes. Taco taught us a really sweet foundation for how to work on the wheel primarily using stoneware, mid-fire stoneware. And so I didn't really have any experience with learning about porcelain or really learning much about glaze as far as like making your own glazes. But I learned a ton about the foundations, like how to make lids and how to throw off the hump and how to grow your cylinders tall, and even did a little bit of hand building with her, but mostly just, manipulating pieces off of the wheel, just the very most important basic foundations of how to work in a studio. And really it was what she taught me and what she showed me that led me to be able to open up my own studio, because she runs a beautiful studio. And so when I did finally decide to open my own studio, I had this great role model for how to make a studio beautiful and functional and flow well and be well organized.
Tell me the story about when you decided to open up your own studio.
Yeah, so I had always in the back of my mind thought that maybe I might do that, but I just wasn't sure. And I mean, things were so nice in the studio with Chaco and all of my friends that I had made. And I loved going in there. So it wasn't really until Chaco had to shut the studio down due to a family emergency, and that kept her away from the country for about 5 months. While that occurred, I just missed throwing so much. And so I got a wheel. And I also got inexpensive desk from the thrift store and a piece of Hardybacker board, and started throwing at home during that time. I didn't know what to do with the work exactly. I pretty much just saved it up. I tried to get it fired in another studio here, but it it was kind of cumbersome to do that. And so I ended up just kind of saving the work until she got back, and then went back to the community studio at first for a while. But I already had things kind of set up here. So it was I was in this place of limbo. So one thing led to another, and I decided to commit to just being here at my own studio that I had started already to create, and continue to have these bonds with these people that I had developed friendships with and already had friendships with before I ever started at Onomi. So that's how I started my studio here. And, every year what I do is I just think of a couple of things that I want to do to improve my studio now. So I just, like last year, I worked on like making my studio better with as far as health and keeping it cleaner. And then this year I added some shelves, which you can see behind me. So every year I just kind of add a little bit more.
What were you feeling when you finally opened up your own studio?
I was super excited about it. At first I was unsure because I love the community so much. And so missing out on those opportunities to talk to people when you go in the studio and to kind of look at what they're doing and things like that. So at first, I was a little bit indecisive about did I make the right decision? But then as time went on and my friends from the studio continued to, hang out with me, and we continued to have this relationship. And Chaco and I are really good friends today. And so I'm always spending time with her. So I started to become more secure in my decision that it was going to be okay to not have that experience as a community member that you would get because of the other people there. And I love having the ability to decide what I'm going to do in my own studio. Porcelain's actually kind of hard to work with. And I don't exclusively work with porcelain, but I was for a while working exclusively with porcelain because it's really hard to work in a membership studio with a lot of different clays if you're trying to work just with porcelain, because that porcelain can get mixed in with other clays and then it's no longer looks like porcelain, So then if I'm making a lot, I need a lot of space. And although it's a really, like I said, it's a really nice space. Sometimes I found that I was a little bit limited in my space requirements for what I wanted to make.
Now, what advice would you give to someone that wants to open their own studio?
Well, I would say that if somebody had told me how much work it was going to be to open up my own studio, I might have shied away from it. I'm really glad I did it, but I think it's something you have to be mentally prepared for. I think if you want to open up your own studio, I think it's good to just take it in small steps and create some sort of a timeline for yourself of like your priorities each year. So like, for example, my priority the first year was just get a wheel and start making on that wheel. And then my next step, of course, was to get a kiln, which is a pretty huge step because it's expensive, it's intimidating. It made me very nervous to have something running at that temperature in my garage. And then, of course, when you get your kiln, you also have to have glazes. And so do you want to mix your own glazes? Do you want to buy manufactured glazes? So there's so many decisions that have to be made. I think it's easy to get overwhelmed. And so I think if you create kind of a timeline for yourself, like, okay, I'm going to give myself the space and the time to take this step by step by step and not try to do it all at once, it's a lot more manageable. So that would be my best advice.
Some excellent advice right there. I absolutely love it. So let's talk about your pottery. Can you tell me the story, how you started making your knitted porcelain pottery that you make today?
Yes. Many years ago, it was probably like 6-7 years ago, something like that. I was in my studio and I was doing something that actually allowed me to listen to a podcast. I don't really listen to a lot of music and podcasts and things like that in my studio, but every once in a while, if I'm wedging or if I'm cleaning, I'll listen to a podcast. And so I had a podcast on and I was only half listening, but I heard the person that was being interviewed say that she did something where she put her knitwear in the kiln and fired it. And I was like, what? This is like, it didn't make any sense to me. There was absolutely like no, like it just, not having an art degree, I'm sure that other people probably were able to quickly make sense of it. But for me, I was like, I don't understand. So but the seed was planted, right? So I kind of filed it away because it was too much to even think about for me at that point, and I was trying to keep myself from going down rabbit holes. And so I just filed it away as something that I was interested in and curious about. But I didn't have the time in my life at that point really to go and research it and, start this new project, because it is definitely, I knew it was going to be kind of a big deal to get started on something like that. But it was something, once I heard about it, I was like, yeah, pretty sure I'm going to try that at some point in the future. So I returned to the idea in the last, 6 months or so. And I started to research it. And what I discovered is there's actually not a whole lot of information out there about how to use your knitwear in your kiln and what the steps are for that. And so I just found this website where a woman had her knitwear up on her website and she was selling it, that her knit porcelain on her website. And I reached out to her. It was beautiful work. I reached out to her. And I said, hey, I love what you make. And turns out she makes lots of different things. She's a painter and, she's made functional wear and, she's definitely got a lot of different things going on. And she wrote me back and she said, what do you like? And I said, I like your knit porcelain. And she said, thank you, and started to kind of engage in a conversation with me through email. And I said, I'm actually thinking about starting to do this. What do you think? Would that, would it be okay? And how do you do it? And she said, I would be happy to mentor you through this. I'd be happy to tell you everything that I know. And basically just gave me some good instruction for how to get started. And again, just like the basic instruction for keeping it not overwhelming, just kind of keeping it simple. And then I have gone back to her and emailed her and communicated with her about some questions that I've had, and she's just been wonderful. And her name is Liz Crane, and she's been instrumental in making sure that, I can do this, and it's been pretty exciting. So that's how I got started.
Absolutely love that. Shaping Nation, if you have questions about a technique that a potter is doing, reach out to them, because more than likely they're going to answer back and they're going to give you the steps to make that process. I absolutely love that.
Yeah.
So now, can you walk me through the steps you take when creating your knitted pottery?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing that I do is I find a knitting pattern that I think will look interesting after it's been fired and also hold up to the firing. So I'm looking for something that maybe has a little bit more of an interesting technique to it, that maybe is some lace work or something that has an interesting shape, or something that I can ultimately shape in an interesting way. And then I knit that with cotton twine. And then after I'm done knitting it, I dip the piece in porcelain slip. That's about the consistency of milkshake, like a milkshake. And it's not a precise recipe. So, just kind of have to just look at the slip, but it is porcelain. And then when I'm done, I let it dry a little bit, and then I sort of wipe off the excess so that those knitting details start to come out. And then I add another layer of slip using a paintbrush that time. That layer is added for extra strength for the piece. And around the same time, I'm forming the piece, adding things like plastic bags and wrapping it over buckets and wrapping it over my pottery seconds and things like that to make it interesting shape. I mean, I have a piece here, like I will add like little clips, in an area that I'm hoping will stay together so I don't want it to fall apart. And then I dry the piece completely and remove the materials that I used for holding the form of the piece. And I then wax the base of the piece, because I'm not going to pull it out in between the bisque fire and the glaze fire. So I go ahead and wax it with a little bit of alumina hydrate in the wax substance. And that's just going to be what stays in the kiln and underneath the piece, because that alumina hydrate will melt off and out of the wax and just remain on the kiln shelf. And then I fire it to cone 05 in an electric kiln. And then I leave it alone. I don't touch it. And then I refire it again to cone 5. And that's pretty much what what I do.
So do you leave the knitted pot in the kiln for both of them? You just like leave it in?
Correct. I just leave it in there.
Why do you do that?
Well, because I haven't gotten the courage yet to fire it all the way through a glaze firing yet, just all the way through. But I think you could probably do that. The reason that I don't touch it after the O5, the bisque firing, is it's too fragile and it'll just basically crumble.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
I loved hearing that process. That was very interesting. So something interesting I found is many of your pots are meant to be used, while some are just used to create a sense of curiosity. Can you tell me more about this?
Yeah. So when I first started to really appreciate pottery, one of the things that I did was as I mentioned earlier, I collect pieces, and some of those pieces are literally intended just to be in a home and making, a home look beautiful, and, kind of curious pieces, like pieces that if you look closely at them, it turns out that form that originally maybe looks like a tree stump has these elements that also are a human body. Or pieces that you look at and you go, how in the world did that artist do that? How did they make that? It's like so fascinating to think about a person's process. And so I started to collect these pieces and started to investigate, like, how did this artist do this? And then when, if I had friends come over and they were like, what do you have here? I like to tell people, like, this is the process that I think that this artist probably used for making this piece. And so that inspiration of what others have done and what I have in my own home from other artists has inspired me, because even though I love making functional wear, I find functional wear really rewarding. I love using other people's functional wear that they've created, and I love knowing that other people are using my functional wear in their home. There's another part of me that feels so much satisfaction when somebody asks me, how did you make that? And I love answering that question, like answering the question of how I made the knit porcelain is actually really exciting for me, because it's a really, like, there's something about making something that other people don't understand that makes it even more interesting, I think. So I think it's really nice to do both. I think it's really nice to find a way to make functional work that, feels beautiful in your hand and against your lips, and that's just the right sort of weight in your hands, or, that makes a dinner look beautiful when plated on it. But I also love pieces that are really just for design and curiosity.
How can someone build curiosity with their pottery?
It kind of comes with starting with something pretty basic, and then as you're making that piece, adding elements to that piece that are unexpected. So, for example, let's just take a piece of knit porcelain. You could just make like a mug, right? You could say, I'm going to try and form a mug because it's going to get fired in a kiln, and I'm going to make something that looks like it's been taken out of a kiln and is like functional wear, but it's not functional wear. But then wouldn't it be cool to also just make the edge of that mug really rough and kind of ragged, because that kind of draws the attention to another thought of maybe this isn't actually a mug, but it looks like a mug. So it's almost like there's two opposing thoughts that are coming in that make you think twice about what you're seeing.
Absolutely love that. Shape Nation, if you can find a way to build curiosity with your pottery, then it sparks ideas, not in just yourself, but also into other people's minds as well. I absolutely love that. So let's talk about discovering your voice. Can you tell me about the moment when you knew you were heading in the right direction with your...
Okay, so finding satisfaction in my work is actually kind of tough for me. I always find there's something that I want to improve upon, something that is close but not quite right. So I make something that when I make something that I actually like, that's actually pretty rare for me. I often make things that never see the light of day because I'm dissatisfied with some small part of the results. So a few years ago, I started to realize that I really like to illustrate my work. But what I was discovering, and this started to happen like a few years ago, is that even though I love the act of decorating, creating stories on my work, I actually don't like having those pieces around me. Like, they don't work for my own aesthetic. And so I have this kind of push-pull of like wanting to illustrate and wanting to decorate in a way that doesn't always fit with my own aesthetic. And that's something that I started to reconcile recently and realized that I really needed to head down the direction more of what is aesthetically pleasing to me, not only what is experientially pleasing, but also what is aesthetically pleasing. So when I figured that out, I started to feel like I was heading in the right direction with my voice because, it's so fun to illustrate work. It's so fun to decorate work, but it doesn't always turn out the way I like. And so a lot of those pieces were getting shelved and not getting put out there. And that's when I started to realize, I need to retool some of what I'm doing here because there's that joyful part of doing the illustrating, but there's also that part that is joyful when that piece comes out of the kiln and you just love it so much, right? So finding that balance. I have this mantra that I also teach a wheel throwing class, and I tell my students the same thing, and that is, it's all practice. It's all practice, especially when you're in the stage that I am in, which, I've been doing this for 12 years, but that I feel very much like I'm still in my infancy with this work because it takes so long to get good at this. So if we remember that it's all practice and we keep that in mind, it takes some of the pressure off. As we're working, we can be more in the flow, and it doesn't feel quite so, it doesn't feel like a pressure cooker, like this piece has to turn out if we just tell ourselves that it's just practice.
Absolutely love that. Shaping Nation, the pottery journey is a long one. And if you start thinking about the pottery journey as it's practice and you're trying to get better, then you're going to find your voice eventually and the pressure is going to be taken off your shoulders. Well, I love that. So now, what would you say was your biggest obstacle when it came to finding your own voice?
Well, actually, two things. I would say time, and I would say going down rabbit holes. My time management is always just such a struggle for me because I came into pottery at a time that I was already in a career. I was a teacher and then a director of a school, and now I'm a coach, and I also work as an instructor for adults, not only in pottery, but also as a dyslexia therapist instructor. So I'm always just feeling this and I love that work too. Like, I love working in my studio and I love my work as an educator. And I spent so many years getting all of these credentials and whatever to become to become this person in the education field, that I can't give that up. I feel like it's a devotion that is really important to my community, and it's important to people who are invested in that field of work. But as I've done more and more pottery, I just love it. I mean, I want to be in here all the time. And so that push-pull, that time management piece is a real struggle for me. And it's getting better. I'm definitely finding ways to figure that out and to make that work. But it's hard. It's a hard balance to strike. And then the other thing I would say is rabbit holes. Even just a few years ago, I was always drawn to I want to try that, and I want to try this, and I want to take that class, and I want to do that workshop. And I just really felt like it was important for my education as a potter to do those courses. But you really, at some point, you really have to say, okay, enough. And now I have to practice those things. And I really have to spend the time working on those things to make it worth my time to actually have taken those courses and those workshops. And if I'm not applying what I've learned, then it's almost a waste of my time to take those classes and workshops. And so I did kind of figure that out just in the last few years, that I was just overwhelming myself with too much education, trying to find out so much information that it was almost too much information, and not really getting into the studio enough and really spending the time with the clay, working with the materials, and figuring out what works and what doesn't.
Absolutely love that. Definitely agree. Shaping Nation, sometimes too much information is too much information. And it's good to get that information, but make sure you're also applying those techniques and practicing getting time in the studio. I absolutely, definitely agree 100% on that. So now, what is something you wish you knew when you were trying to find your own unique voice?
Well, think, that coming together of your own personal aesthetic and that which brings you joy to make, both of those things are important in the process of finding our voice. And so we might be doing something in the studio, and I mentioned this earlier, we might be doing something in the studio. I might be doing something in the studio that I really love the process of, but then when I open up the kiln, it's not something that I am proud of. And so you can love the process, but you got to also love the outcome. You have to love both. I would also say that, finding my voice is something that I think it doesn't just happen overnight. It doesn't happen like, one day you don't have a voice and the next day you do. It's a continuum. It's like you start to find your voice and it grows with you as you know yourself more as an artist, as you know your work more and what pleases you and what experiences you love to create for others and yourself. That's when you start to find your voice. It doesn't mean that it happened. Now you have your voice. It's more like that's when it starts to happen. So it's a process. It takes time. It's not something that happens overnight.
Absolutely agree. I definitely agree 100%. So now, what advice would you give to someone that is looking to discover their own unique voice with their pottery?
I would say, finding your voice requires a lot of time. So getting in that studio frequently, spending a lot of time doing your work, knowing that it's all practice, spending a lot of time looking at other people's work to get familiar with different techniques and different appearances, trying out different things so that experiment with things. Does this work for me? Is this something that resonates for me? Or is this just something that doesn't quite bring me joy? I mean, that's, for me anyway, that's the main reason that I go in the studio. That's the main reason that I work, that I make in the studio, is because I'm finding joy in that. And so figure out what brings you joy, especially both parts, the making part and also the final product.
Excellent piece of advice right there. Michelle, it's been great chatting with you today. And as we're coming to a close here, what is one thing you want to hammer home with my listeners today?
I would say it's all practice. Enjoy the process, experiment, and make sure that you remain in love with the process and the materials and the experience, and your voice will come when it comes. So just let that pressure go.
So excellent parting words of advice.